So all living things have a range of conditions they can survive in. And mostly the conditions we're talking about here are the abiotic factors in the ecosystem. That idea of range is really important. So the first of these we're going to talk about is temperature. And here's bacteria again. Remember we talked about the thermal vents on the bottom of the ocean a little bit? You know, that life exists in the deep parts of our planet. So those thermal vents on the bottom of the ocean are where you have water that is spewing out of cracks in the sort of the bottom of the crust, really, coming out of the lower part of the crust where the earth is molten or semi-molten, and that water can be nearly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's superheated water. It only exists as a liquid because it's under so much pressure from the weight of the ocean pushing down on it. But it's insanely hot, way, way, way above boiling point. There are bacteria that actually live in that water. Yeah. We've actually taken sensors down there. So there are usually remote submersibles. That's how we've gotten a lot of our information about the thermal vents. And the first pictures that came out of those in the late 80s, early 90s, people were shocked. Like nothing like that had been seen. There were whole new life forms. There were thousands of species that were discovered within a few years of us actually getting down to those thermal vents. Stuff we had no idea could exist. There are also actually, do you all know what a geyser is? Like Yellowstone is full of, thermally heated water. It's these awesome hot pools. The entire country of Iceland is covered. It's like this little Nordic paradise with hot tubs, natural hot tubs in the rocks everywhere. Those are also water coming up out of, the lower layers of the earth where it's really hot. And that's also very hot water. There are bacteria that live in places like that. If you ever get a chance to go to the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of thermal activity, a lot of hot springs there, natural hot springs, because it's an area with a lot of volcanic activity, and you tend to have volcanic activity and hot springs going hand in hand. There are bacteria that live in those hot springs. Now, I thought we cooked bacteria to kill them. That's why we cook our hamburger, right? Because bacteria can't regulate their own body temp? Right. So how can we have bacteria living in 750 degree water? Boiling isn't going to kill that.
You'd freeze it.
Well, those particular species of bacteria have evolved in those locations, and they are well suited for their environment. Natural selection has pushed them to these extreme tolerance ranges. They can do just fine there. On the other end of it, so we have the Arctic and the Antarctic, the top and bottom of the planet. Pretty cold. We don't think of there as being a lot of plant life. But in Antarctica, so that's where the penguins are, that's the South Pole, there are actually little tiny plants that live in rocks. And they're small, they're little scrubby things. I need to get a picture in this slide of that. It gets down to nearly 100 below zero, nearly negative 100 Fahrenheit. And there are plants that survive that. Your delicate little tomato plant freaks out when it hits 30. Burns up, shrivels up, and dies.
Nice. When it hits 30?
Yeah, when it gets the first time you get even a light frost, your tomato plants are cooked. They're done. They're done for the year. Yeah, they're killed. Their tissues all die. They look like they've been burnt, but it's really the frost. So how can you have a plant that can tolerate that kind of temperature? Now, that plant that can withstand nearly 100 below would probably die exposed to 32 degree weather. It would probably be too warm for it. You have organisms that can stand extremes, but there's nothing that can tolerate that big a range. So the idea is this. Well, and we can talk about human temperature, for that matter. Do you know what we mean by core temp?
I inner temperature.
Well, it's actually the temp of your guts.
That's inner. That counts.
That's
I would-
core, you know? So your core is your trunk is your core, basically. Yeah.
I have a question.
So what's normal human temperature?
90.
98.6, yeah. And for like, I'm a low normal, mine's 97. There are people who run a 99 normal. But you know, somewhere between about 97 and 99 degrees is normal average temperature. If your core temperature drops below about 86 degrees, you die. It's called hypothermia. So,
What if we grew up like we're adapted to that?
well, humans, you could have humans who evolve in different regions of the world, and it'd be a really fascinating study to look at average core temp in people whose ancestors, like Inuits. So,
Like cold weather.
you know, now Inuit people have culturally evolved a lot of mechanisms and behaviors. We can talk about cultural evolution too, to stay warm, to keep their body temperature at that 98 degree mark. You know, the use of furs, eating lots of fat. Now, Inuits, people whose ancestors have been in those polar region, in the North Pole region, for approximately 10,000, 15,000 years. Inuits actually their bodies process fat differently, and you see all these pictures of these chubby Inuits. That's because they store fat like crazy. You put me and an Inuit on the same number of calories per day and the same amount of exercise per day, the Inuit at the end of 6 months is going to weigh more than I do, and it's more of it's going to be fat. They store fat, so their bodies have evolved mechanisms. Not that their core temp requirements are different, but they have evolved mechanisms to keep their core temp in that range. Yeah, certainly humans could shift. You know,
There's a girl from Alaska that rides around Guilford Lake. She rides her bike from Guilford Lake to Lisbon and said that this weather ain't nothing compared to what she used to. She rides around with a t-shirt and
yeah. Well, and that's acclimatization versus her body core still needs to stay in that range, but she's acclimatized to different weather, so that's a different thing. If your core temp starts to drop, has anybody here ever been out in the cold and your fingers start to get kind of fumbly and you can't pick up the pen and you can't?
I think it's
Yeah, they get stiff. They don't work real well. Has anybody ever gotten frostbite? That's serious. Like you get actual tissue damage, and you lose. I mean, in extreme cases of frostbite, people lose their fingertips and their toes. They turn black. They fall off. Blood flow stops. So I know none of you have little black stumps. So you haven't had that kind of. You can have very mild frostbite, and you'll get like little. It looks like a burn. It looks like a white area from a burn, but it's actually because your body's gotten so cold. Your body is shutting off blood flow out to the extremities.
Have you ever seen the Salt and Ice Challenge?
Yeah, we're not going there. Your body is shutting off blood flow to the extremities. Why?
Because it doesn't want to be cold.
Because you can live without fingers and toes.
Okay.
You can't.
Does your brain know that? It's like,
Yeah, well, your autonomic nervous system does. And so as your extremities get colder, the body goes, whoa, 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 whoa. We got enough work to do keeping the organs warm,
kick them out.
keeping the brain warm. So the body starts to restrict blood flow out to the extremities because those are the farthest away from the warm parts. You know, this is the part that has to stay warm in the brain. Likewise, at high temperatures, the body will shunt fluids out. Your fingers get kind of swollen and red if you're, working real hard in the heat. Your body is shunting blood out to the extremities to try to cool it. Your fingers, your toes are kind of thin, they're kind of out there. They make great radiator fins. So your body is working to keep you in that range. Here's the thing to think about. Do you remember what this is called?
Bell curve.
Bell curve, normal distribution. So there's a bell curve for every one of these biotic conditions in terms of what you can tolerate. And if life is good and your body is not having to work very hard to keep everything where it wants it to be, we could call this your green zone. Life is pretty good. Life is pretty easy. You can grow well, you can reproduce, you're not having to spend so much energy doing other things that, you know, you're wasting a lot of energy on other stuff. Life is good. You're thriving. Now, if things get a little bit tougher, we might call this the yellow. So you're still okay. You may still actually be able to grow yourself, but you might not be doing well enough that you're capable of reproduction. We can think about this in terms of a lot of things. Right now we're just talking about temperature. My little yeasty beasties here. My little yeasty beasties, if we get some yeast and some flour and get some bread dough going, if they're sitting at about 100 degrees, so between 90 and 100, they will grow, they will reproduce, they will fart out lots of carbon dioxide, they will make lots of alcohol. They are doing everything they can do. They are thriving. Their population will grow. They will continue to reproduce. They're in the green zone. Now, if I drop that temperature down, and I have them sitting at room temperature right now, it's probably not quite 70 in here, they're definitely in their yellow zone. So they're alive. Each individual yeasty could grow. Yeasty beastie. But they don't really have enough, they're too cold to reproduce. The same thing would happen if I heated them up on the other side of 100. If I get that water temp up to 110, 115, it's too hot for them to reproduce. So if I drop the temperature even a little bit more, I get down into this range. Well, they're going to survive, but they're not going to grow. They're not going to do well. They can survive. They're certainly not going to reproduce. They're not thriving in any way. And if I make it just a little bit more extreme on either end, either a little hotter or a little colder, guess what happens? Guess what happens there?
They'll die.
They die.
I think we'll die too.
Yeah, you would too. So the same is true for humans. And we can look at temperature with this. You know, the zone where you're happy, your body temperature is within a couple degrees of 98.6. Your body temperature is right in that middle range. When you have a low-grade fever, like, a degree of elevation, you're okay. You're still growing. You're still surviving. But you probably don't do things as well as you could at a normal temperature. If we put you out in the cold and your body core temp starts to drop a little bit, you're not going to be as efficient at doing things. Your body's spending a lot of extra energy on just maintaining temperature. We get you a little bit further out of your comfort zone, things get worse. You at that point probably, so for instance, if we had a child who somehow, through some horrible environmental circumstance, grew up having a low-grade fever their entire life.
No, it's not.
Like their body was supposed to be 98.6, but they had a fever of 100 from birth on. They might not be able to reproduce. They might not become biologically mature. Biological maturity measured as the point at which you can reproduce. They would be outside that range. Their growth would probably be stunted. Like a lot of things would be not as expected because you've got these ranges in which you do best, you do okay, and you just barely hang on. And that's true for any organism and for any set of abiotic factors. We'll copy that because we'll need it again. So one of my plans was we were going to warm up our little yeasties and cool them down and see what happened. But we can't even see them. I just need to clean it. I'll have my lab aide clean it out.
We can rebirth this.
Don't think so. Okay, so precipitation, same thing. Okay? This is just another abiotic factor. That little thing that I've drawn, that's called a tolerance curve. You have desert plants, I mean plants that live in the desert that literally may go for a decade without measurable rainfall ever hitting them. And then you have plants in a rainforest that are getting 200 inches of water a year. So then it would completely drown that desert plant. They're well adapted to their own situation, to their own environment. They've been selected for. But none of them can exist in that entire range. So every living thing has a range of conditions it can tolerate. And we call it we can graph it and call it a tolerance curve. We'll do an entire slide on tolerance curves. Yeah?
If my body can say like a normal temperature is like 94, why does it raise so high like you have a fever?
Well, multiple reasons. Fever is actually an immune response designed to kill bacteria. And there was actually just a really interesting article on Science Daily talking about the fact that some symptoms of, cold or flu are also really sort of a evolution at the population level, where human populations survive better when sick people didn't go out and spread their germs around. And so the diseases that we have with us today and your immune response to them tend to really kind of push you to stay home and not spread your germs around. But yeah, I mean, fever is an immune response because bacteria can't regulate their own temperature. So if you raise your temperature sufficiently, then a lot of bacteria die off. When I was a kid, like when my daughter has had, well, yeah, it's your body trying to fight it off. Same reason, like if you get a cut that gets infected, it gets red and hot to the touch. Your body's raising the temperature where the bacteria are. We used to always, like control kids' fever when I was a kid. If you had a fever, you immediately got, children's Tylenol. And now what a lot of doctors say, and this is kind of the tack we take with my daughter, and unless it gets over, like 103, or the child is indicating like severe discomfort from the fever, let the fever run. Keep them hydrated, give them lots of fluids. So like we've not usually given my daughter anything for fever. You do. You get inactivated virus so that your body recognizes it when it comes around. Yeah. So anyway, with this precipitation curve, a plant from the rainforest wouldn't survive in the desert. A desert plant wouldn't survive in the rainforest. They're all very well adapted to their environment. And they've got the range of conditions that they can tolerate. It's not the line I wanted to draw. There we go. Okay, the last abiotic factor we're going to talk about is pH. So this was my other great plan. pH is how acid or base something is. And neutral is neither acid nor base. You probably had that in physical science, but you might not remember it. Okay, so neutral is not acid or base. And there are some things that live in very acidic soil. How many of you have ever stood underneath a pine tree? Good. Okay, James, you have homework. Okay. Good. Okay. You notice that the ground under them is pretty bare. Nice soft carpet of pine needles. Pine needles tend to be very acidic. When they decompose in the soil, they make the soil very acidic. You're going to have bacteria that would live in the soil under a pine tree that would not be capable of living in the soil in your yard that's not under that pine tree, that's less acidic. Same thing for alkaline soils, especially out west. You find a lot of real alkaline soils like Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. And if you imagine adding baking soda to your garden, that would make your soil very alkaline. It's the opposite of acid. Again, nothing can stand that entire range. My experiment or my demonstration for this with our little yeasty beasties was going to be taking one little slide of them and adding vinegar and watching what happened to them, and another with a baking soda solution and watching what happened to them. This is why things like Clorox kills bacteria. You know this, right? Clorox is super, super alkaline. Question. James, did you have a question?
So at the time, there's like this weird, something, not like moss, but it's like pine needles, and they're like weaved together, and it's growing up the side of my pine tree for like years. I don't even know.
Why sometimes, like in the south, like the soil like pinkish?
You have different regional soil types. Like Missouri is famous for their red soils, and like red clay in Georgia, and it's just the minerals that go into making up that soil. So it's geological. Yeah. Okay. So again, for acidity, guess what? Same thing. We have that tolerance curve. There is, and you know what? The same thing exists with humans for pH in your blood. Your blood has a pH that's preferable. They do a test.
I'm still taking notes. That's on that.
Do you have your vocabulary out?
You said there was only one vocabulary word that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. But we're going to do that after we finish this. So you might not want to put that away. You have a tolerance range for acidity as well. So within a range, and your blood is normally, I believe, slightly alkaline, like 7 to 7.5 pH. Too acid, you're not healthy. Too alkaline, you're not healthy. So all of these things have this tolerance curve. And the next slide we do is going to be actually tolerance curves. Everything has a zone where they're happy, thriving, growing, able to reproduce, as well as a zone where it's just death. And this is true for temperature, it's true for precipitation, it's true for soil pH, it's true for body pH. What you can tolerate, and what you can tolerate is largely a product of the natural selection that you're well adapted for your environment. Okay. I'll show you the next slide and we can discuss it tomorrow, but you can get the vocab in for it now. So how well something does under changing conditions. And that's, again, this little tolerance curve. And we can superimpose that there. And graph it. And it's a good visual. It's a good visual. Within this range where everybody is growing and thriving and reproducing, that would be the green range. That's where the population can grow, because everybody is doing so well. Here, individuals might grow, but the population probably doesn't. Here, everybody is just surviving. And out there on that outer margin, there be death and destruction. Okay? So we'll come back to this tomorrow.